My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the Deputy Director of the JDC Archives, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's book talk with Jacob Daniels. Before we start today's program, I'd like to share a few words about the JDC Archives. The JDC Archives holds the records of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC or the Joint, which is the leading Jewish humanitarian organization that has been providing assistance to Jews around the world for more than a century. Our collections include millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of photographs, hundreds of artifacts, as well as audio, video, and film recordings dating back to the founding of the organization in 1914. Our collections are used by scholars from around the world, as well as by publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators, filmmakers, and many others. Because a large portion of our material has been digitized and made available online, they are easily accessible to all these audiences. We also offer fellowships that enable scholars to conduct research in the JDC archives, helping to further expand and deepen the study of our collections. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jacob Daniels. Dr. Daniels received his PhD in history from Stanford University in 2022. He's currently an assistant professor of instruction and the assistant director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Today, he will introduce his new book, The Jews of Edirne, The End of Ottoman Europe and the Arrival of Borders, that was published by Stanford University Press in 2025. Jacob will present for about 40 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. Please note that your microphones are muted and we'll take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the program. Jacob will now start his lecture.
Hello, everyone. Let me first thank you all for joining. It's really exciting to see such a large crowd interested in, my work, the Jews of Edirne. Not every day do I get to speak to so many people on this topic. So thank you for taking the time to listen. And of course, I'd like to thank the JDC for inviting me to this prestigious series, especially Isabel Rohr, Abra Cohn, and Abby Lester. Thank you so much. And maybe a belated thanks to archivist Misha Mitzel, who helped me years ago in some of the early stages of the research that eventually became this book. So very grateful to the JDC on a number of levels. So let me start out by reading the first page and a half from the introduction of the book. There's really, I've thought long and hard about this, and I've no better way to introduce the topic than this. So if you'll permit me. The best view of Edirne, Turkey, is from Greece. Should you find yourself approaching the border town of Kastanyes on European Route E85, scan the checkerboard of brown and green fields to the east. Beyond Greek Kastanyes, chestnut, and Turkish Karaağaç, elm, between the Thracian plain in the foreground and the Stranja Mountains in the background, a massive 4-minaret mosque looms on a hill over the sleepy borderland, pompously overdressed for the occasion. This is Selimiye, the dominant feature of Edirne's otherwise modest skyline. Upon its completion in 1575, Selimiye was the largest mosque in the Ottoman Empire. By choosing to build his namesake monument in Edirne, the former capital, instead of Istanbul, the contemporary one, Sultan Selim II may have been recognizing Edirne as the empire's second most important city. After all, it was the frequent home of the Sultan's court and the staging ground for military campaigns that had pushed the imperial frontier to the meadows between Budapest and Vienna, 700 miles away. Historians list several factors that could have motivated Selim II to build his mosque in Edirne, but improving the view for people in a foreign country is not one of them. With a population of 180,000, Edirne is now a secondary city, known mostly for its monumental Ottoman architecture and its border checkpoints with two European member states, Bulgaria and Greece. Its difficult passage from central city to border town started in the 19th century when the Ottomans began their piecemeal retreat from Europe. By 1908, an official state border existed just north of the city. Over the next 14 years, that border would move back and forth across Edirne, wreaking havoc in the process. When the Ottoman Empire officially dissolved in 1923, the city found itself in a new country called the Republic of Turkey. At that point, the border stopped moving, but the borderland continued to be a place where, quote, the future is always uncertain, as a local Jew had said in 1910. For Edirne residents, the first decades of the 20th century were largely defined by the shifting position and meaning of the state border. Compared to their Muslim and Christian neighbors, the Jews of Edirne, both the city and the larger province, experienced the border in ways that tended to be less bloody but more complex. On the eve of the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, Edirne province was home to one of the world's oldest and largest communities of Ladino-speaking Sephardim, Jews who trace their lineage to medieval Spain and Portugal. These people dodged a series of ethnic cleansing campaigns that targeted Muslims and then Christians in the period 1912 to 1922. But in 1934, Jews across the region, which had come to be called Eastern Thrace, were attacked by neighbors in a week of violence that prompted a Jewish exodus from the borderland, but killed no Jews. The so-called Thrace events, Trakya olayları in Turkish, remain the only case of mob violence against Jews in the history of the Turkish Republic. How did Edirne's Jewish community survive the horrors of the last Ottoman decade, only to unravel during the relatively peaceful years of the early Turkish Republic? That is a central question of this book. The answers have much to do with the border, the identities it could and could not generate, the violence it could and could not legitimate, and the survival strategies pursued by local Jews within this tricky matrix. So here's the view of Edirne, Turkey from Greece. I wonder if it matches with the description that I read out loud a moment ago. Edirne was, again, Selimiye Mosque in Edirne was once the largest mosque in the Ottoman Empire. In what I've read, I think we've just heard some main themes of the book. A central place becoming a borderland, the uneven effects that this process had on different ethno-religious groups, and the complicated relationship between Jews and violence in this part of the world. Those three themes will reappear throughout my talk. These maps, by the way, were created by my friend, the Turkish artist Cem Dinlenmiş. We had a very, very long WhatsApp thread going back and forth, creating these maps for the book, and they appear at the beginning of the book. So let's start with the beginning. In chapter 1 of the book, I emphasize that for much of its history, Edirne was an extremely diverse place in the heart of Ottoman Europe. As we see here, until 1877, the city of Edirne was hundreds of miles from a foreign country. That border, this dotted line that you see over here, is the border of the province, not the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, the province had a Christian majority. So even in a proverbially diverse empire, such as the Ottoman Empire, Edirne is an especially diverse province. By 1908, Bulgaria had officially seceded from the Ottoman Empire, and a recognized state border ran just north of Edirne. Still, the province continued to be a place of striking ethno-religious diversity, even by Ottoman standards. It was home to about 620,000 Muslims, 340,000 Orthodox Greeks, 120,000 Bulgarian Christians, 26,000 Armenians, and 24,000 Jews. Intercommunal violence was relatively rare, but daily life was very much structured along ethno-religious lines. For example, the Jews of Edirne were governed by Ottoman authorities, but also local Jewish councils and a regional chief rabbi. If a Jew fell sick, he or she would probably be treated by the local Bikur Cholim Society, the Visiting the Sick Society. Jewish children attended Talmud Torah schools, or increasingly, schools run by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, an international Jewish organization based in Paris. And poor relief came largely from within the Jewish community. Much of the funding for these institutions came from the largesse of Jewish merchants and a sales tax on kosher foods, known as the Gabela. Meanwhile, the border of the Ottoman Empire remained relatively easy to cross in the early 20th century. Edirne Jews continued to visit Bulgaria, a young country that was home to many of their fellow Ladino speakers and family members in some cases. In fact, the train ride to Plovdiv, Bulgaria was probably easier than the ride to Ottoman Salonika, today Thessaloniki, Greece. Maybe I can just show that on our map here. Edirne to Plovdiv, Bulgaria, crossing a border, but relatively easy. Edirne to Thessaloniki, to what was then called Salonika, which is a domestic itinerary, no crossing of a state border, but we know from newspapers at the time, there were all sorts of checkpoints and inspections, the kinds of things that today we might associate with an international trip. When traveling from Edirne to Salonika, for example, the train would stop in Drama, where the Ottoman authorities disinfected the train cars, inspected the documents of all passengers, and recorded everyone's names. In Southeast Europe, circa 1908, the boundaries between Ottoman provinces or ethno-religious communities were no less formidable than the borders between states. State borders were not special. Bulgaria declared its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1908. More famously, that was the year of the Young Turk Revolution. After a group of officers and bureaucrats forced the Sultan to restore parliament and reinstate the Ottoman constitution, Edirne's Muslims, Christians, and Jews celebrated the dawn of a liberal era. Intercommunal unity, ittihad in Turkish, became the watchword of the revolution, and new freedoms of the press and association allowed newspapers and clubs to proliferate. What emerged, however, was not a general public sphere so much as several public spheres. Muslims read newspapers printed in Turkish, Orthodox Greeks read newspapers printed in Greek, Bulgarian Christians had newspapers in Bulgarian, Armenians had newspapers written in Armenian, and after 1910, Jews had a newspaper published in Ladino, which we see here. Sometimes called Judeo-Spanish, Ladino was the language of Balkan Sephardim, and it was printed in Rashi Hebrew letters, except for the title of the paper and the headlines, which are in the normal block letters. Called La Voz de la Verdad, the voice of truth, Edirne's Jewish newspaper urged its readers to see themselves as, quote, Ottoman and Jewish at the same time, as members of both the Pueblo Otomano and the Nación Judía, the Ottoman people and the Jewish nation. According to the editor, Joseph Bar-Ishaq, these two roles were perfectly compatible because defending the interests of the Jewish community involved exercising the rights and freedoms granted by the Ottoman constitution. You'll note that actually the title also appears in Ottoman Turkish in the center. You'll note there's Ladino in the Rashi, and there's also part of it's printed in the Latin alphabet. So just give you, this reflects the diversity of an Ottoman city like Edirne. In fact, Edirne Jews were so emboldened by the promises of the revolution that a Jewish protest in 1910 erupted into a shootout between protesters and police. There are not many shootouts between Ottoman Jews and Ottoman authorities that I know of in the history of the Ottoman Empire, but this is one of them. Miraculously, no one was killed. According to the British consul in Edirne, both sides were not expert marksmen. Alternatively, I wonder if both sides were intentionally shooting above each other's heads, not shooting to kill. Several Jews were arrested, but all were eventually acquitted. The Edirne incident, as it was dubbed by the Jewish press in Istanbul, became something of a Rorschach test. Some saw in it the government's commitment to the rule of law. All arrested Jews were eventually acquitted. Others saw it as a sign that Jewish political activity in the Ottoman borderland could not exceed certain limits, even in an age of liberty. In terms of political energy and population size, Edirne's Jewish community reached its peak in the years following the Young Turk Revolution. But by the fall of 1912, this era was coming to a close. The pivotal event was the Balkan Wars. When a coalition led by Bulgaria and Greece attacked the Ottoman Empire, Edirne's Bulgarian and Greek speakers suddenly became suspect in the eyes of their Turkish-speaking neighbors. Notice I'm taking pains not to call these people Bulgarians or Greeks because that might suggest that they are affiliated with the state of Bulgaria or the state of Greece. They are Christians who are Ottoman citizens and speak Bulgarian, Greek, Armenian, etc. The arrival of Muslim refugees from the Balkans only reinforced the idea that local Christians no longer had a place in Edirne. But with no enemy state claiming to represent them, local Jews faced fewer questions about their political loyalties. Some of them made strong displays of their Ottoman patriotism. For example, many young men fought in the Ottoman army, and one became the first Jewish officer in Ottoman history. So, moving on, La Voz de la Verdad would actually, publication would be interrupted during the Balkan Wars. But here we have another example of Jewish patriots in the Ottoman Empire. What do we see here? We see two Jewish women volunteering with their Muslim male colleagues at Edirne's military hospital during Bulgaria's siege of the city. Those armbands you see are Ottoman Red Crescent armbands. Their patriotism was soon recognized in an official letter of gratitude from the governor of Edirne province. Now, I know from other sources that these two women are Angel Giron and Rosa Avigdor. So, in fact, Angel Giron, both of them, in fact, were directors of Alliance girls' schools in the region. And Angel Giron kept a journal, a diary, during the Bulgarian siege of the city. That is one of the best sources we have about this incident. So I knew from her description in the journal of her work at the military hospital, working with her colleague, Rosa Avigdor, that obviously these are the two women pictured, but I didn't know who was who, which was frustrating, especially because I wanted to use this image on the cover of my book. At the 11th hour, when I was getting permission from the Alliance archive to use the photo, when I was requesting the high resolution version of the file, the director of the archive said to me, "Sure, I can give you the high res photo. Which version do you want? The one with or without the captions?" I said, "There's a version with captions?" He said, "Yeah." And then he sent me this, which was amazing because you can see at the bottom in Ottoman Turkish and the Arabic letters, each person is mentioned, according to where they stand. So at the 11th hour, I was able to add in the beginning of the book that, in fact, here to our left, we have Madame Giron, is what that says. And to our right, we have Mademoiselle Avigdor, which is what this says here. In March 1913, Bulgarian forces finally occupied the city of Edirne. Local Jews had little choice but to accept that they now lived in a region called New Bulgaria. Despite her pro-Ottoman sentiments, even the aforementioned Angel Giron adjusted quickly to the new reality. Her responsibilities as director of the local Alliance Girls' School compelled her to work with Bulgarian Jewish leaders in a wider effort to reorganize the school network and rebuild the region. When Ottoman forces retook the city a few months later, so it was only for a few months that Edirne was Bulgarian, Giron wrote a joyous entry in her journal. But she also noted that the Ottomans could learn a thing or two from the departing Bulgarians. For example, the Slavic occupiers had quickly required all business to be done in Bulgarian, while the Ottomans, in contrast, had never forced people to use Ottoman Turkish. Quote, "The Turks are more tolerant," wrote Giron, "but I believe they are wrong, at least regarding language. Their non-Muslim citizens would be more attached to the Ottoman nation if they spoke the language of the Ottomans." And this is a photograph from Edirne during the Bulgarian occupation. There are very few photographs of street scenes of people in Ottoman Edirne. There's a lot of photos of architecture, but one of the few photographs of a street scene, it comes from the period of Bulgarian occupation. And you can see some sort of Bulgarian uniformed authority over here. You can see Bulgarian flags hanging in the background, and you can see the aforementioned Selimiye Mosque dominating the background. While the Ottomans managed to reclaim the city of Edirne, the Balkan Wars and their aftermath left conspicuous scars on the region. The Ottomans lost most of their Balkan territory. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims fled that zone, and a similar number of Ottoman Christians were forced out of the Edirne region and western Anatolia. In Edirne province, the Jewish community was about the only group not subjected to campaigns of ethnic cleansing at this time. How often do you hear that? Surrounded by a swirl of violence and compelled to adopt a more cautious style of politics, we might say that the Jews of Edirne were in the eye of the storm. For Muslims and Christians, the border was becoming a sorter of ethno-religious groups, each of which was supposed to have its own state. So the thinking went. In contrast, local Jews still did not see the border as a limit to their zone of belonging, and they continued to associate and identify with Ladino speakers across the Balkans. What is true today was already true then. Borders mean different things to different people. Back to the map. Sadly, the Edirne region would continue to be gripped by violence. This map shows the region in 1915, after both Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire joined World War I on the side of Germany and Austria. In a bid to get Bulgaria to join the Central Powers, the Ottomans gave their neighbor a strip of land on the west bank of the Maritsa River. That, combined with the territorial losses of the Balkan Wars, caused the border to almost surround the city of Edirne. It was in this context that the Armenian genocide, which started near the Ottoman border with Russia in the east, reached the Ottoman borderland near Bulgaria in the northwest. Throughout Edirne province, and especially in the port city of Tekirdağ on the Marmara Sea, Armenian citizens of the Ottoman Empire were rounded up, loaded onto cattle cars, and sent to die in the Syrian deserts. Contemporary Jewish sources are largely silent on the episode. Presumably, Jews were afraid to write anything that might inflame the Ottoman authorities at this time. And this is notable because the fact that Armenians were deported from Edirne as far as you can get from the Ottoman Russian front belies the apologist narrative that we hear, the official Turkish narrative, by the way, regarding the Armenian genocide, which says something along the lines of, it was the fog of war, it was chaos, yes, bad things happened, but it was not an orchestrated genocide. The story of Armenians being deported and sent to die from Edirne province seems to belie that narrative. World War I was hardly a good period for the Jews of Edirne, as evidenced by the fact that wealthier community members were leaving the borderland for Istanbul. But once again, Edirne Jews did not become victims of ethnic cleansing. In fact, they sometimes proved useful in the Ottoman-Bulgarian wartime alliance. For example, the above-mentioned Joseph Bariskhak, the newspaper editor who had put down his newspaper during the war, um, left that business for a job at the Ottoman consulate in Bulgarian Karachi, which is just across the border from Edirne. Before long, he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Sofia. So it turns out that an Ottoman Jew who speaks several languages and has experience in Bulgaria where many of his Jewish colleagues and perhaps family members live, was a useful asset for the Ottomans in their wartime alliance with Bulgaria. Another change in the border. After the Ottomans lost World War I, the Edirne region, now called Eastern Thrace, was again occupied by a foreign country, but this time it was Greece, not Bulgaria. The Greek annexation of Thrace became official in the summer of 1920. In nearby Kavala, which would be somewhere around here, in nearby Kavala, a local Jew spoke the following words at a public celebration. Quote, "From Epirus to Edirne, over 300,000 Jews wildly applauded the victories of this valiant and heroic Greek people. Today in Thrace, the sun shines brighter. Over the entire region flies this blue and white striped flag." The Greek flag, however, would not be the only blue and white banner to appear in Eastern Thrace around this time. Zionism, which had been slow to take hold in Edirne during the late Ottoman period, quickly gained popularity among local Jewish communities, only to vanish from public life when the Greek occupation ended in 1922. The Greek administration largely approved of Zionism, which was seen as a fellow nationalist movement fighting for secession from the Ottoman Empire. After 1922, it would be hated by the Turkish government for the same reason. And by the way, the Greek occupation, or perhaps we should call it annexation, Edirne is part of Greece, and contemporary maps showed it as part of Greece. Unlike Smyrna, aka Izmir, the more famous or infamous occupation, Smyrna, Izmir did not appear on maps as part of Greece, but Edirne did. And it's during this period, the only time in history when a local Edirne Jew was elected to the parliament of the ruling country was during this period, when a local man named Solomon Mitrani was elected to Greek parliament in Athens off this map. Zionist societies appeared in Eastern Thrace as early as 1919 when the region was visited by a representative of the Zionist Federation of the East, based in Istanbul, over here, across the border, I might add. By 1921, the city of Edirne was home to chapters of Shivat Zion, Return to Zion, Tzerei Zion, Youth of Zion, Bnei Zion, Sons of Zion, and Benot Zion, Daughters of Zion. When the British Mandate for Palestine was ratified in 1922, 3,000 people filled the Great Synagogue of Edirne to celebrate. At least this is what we read in a contemporary Ladino newspaper. I read in other sources that the Great Synagogue of Edirne had a maximum capacity of 2,000. So you always have to take these sources with a grain of salt and read them against each other. But safe to say, many people filled the Great Synagogue of Edirne to celebrate. Young members of the Maccabi Sports Club wore their blue and white uniforms, and the Jewish orphanage brass band played the Greek national anthem, followed by Hatikva. And again, I think this nicely illustrates that Zionism harmonized with Greek rule. Uh, it served the Jewish community well to navigate the political uncertainties of the time, and for their part, the Greek authorities were perfectly content with what they saw as a fellow anti-Ottoman movement. However, and I want to emphasize this, what we see was a largely symbolic Zionism that had more to do with local factors and practical considerations than a Jewish state in Palestine or official ideology. Constant political flux and uncertainty about the future pushed many Edirne Jews toward a version of Zionism that provided a neutral path in treacherous political terrain. In a disputed borderland where the only political certainty seemed to be the presence of a nation state, as opposed to any particular nation state, Jews employed a vague form of Zionism that was useful less for what it meant than for what it avoided, namely other nationalisms. For the Jews of Eastern Thrace, modern nationalism was not an exciting chance to break with the past so much as a dangerous, obligatory game in which the safest strategy could be a modified version of Zionism that evoked old patterns of communal autonomy from the Ottoman era. There's an anecdote that I came across in a family history from the region that nicely illustrates this idea. At some point, I think in 1919, the French had sort of temporarily occupied the area, and some meeting was being called where leaders from each religious community were to send a couple of representatives to like sit at a table, and they're going to talk about the future of the region. And the Jewish leaders were asked, which flag do you want to hang from your table? Obviously, a loaded question. And they said the Jewish flag. That's all the sources say. I mean, presumably, this is a version of what is today the flag of the state of Israel. So again, um, a sort of Zionism less as a passionate ideology, more as a defense strategy and a way to stay neutral in a place where Jews don't know who will be the master of the realm tomorrow. To an extent, this strategy paid off when the Greeks, both the military administration and everyday Greek Orthodox civilians, were ousted from the region by the Turkish national movement. And here we see a picture taken by the French photographer Frederick Gadmir in November 1922. Local Greeks, what seems to be a sort of combination of forceful expulsion combined with perhaps calls by the Greek authorities, for everyday Greek Orthodox people to leave. Some combination creates a sense of flight, and most local Greek speakers leave and head across the border to Greece. By the way, yes, many took trains, as we see here, but from the written sources, we know that many just walked. Presumably, the poorer folks, I think, just grabbed what they could and then walked across the border. This is the last map. This, besides Yugoslavia, this map more or less shows us today's map, today's three-way border between Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece. When Edirne became part of the new Republic of Turkey, local Jews could plausibly claim they had not been pro-Greek so much as pro-Jewish. With that said, Zionist activity ceased or was forced underground during the first decade of the Turkish Republic. From 1923 to 1933, the Jews of Edirne experienced pressure to assimilate in the cultural realm and resentment in the economic realm. Still, this was a relatively peaceful time compared to the period 1912 to 1922, an admittedly low bar. But the 1920s and early 1930s, the first decade of the Turkish Republic, are marked by plenty of tension and certainly economic resentment. And this is a side note, but I think a very apropos side note. This was what I used the JDC archives for. I wanted to get a better sense of the economic scene in this region at the time. And I'm sorry. Well, you know what? It's for the best. This is relevant. I want to get a better sense of the economic scene at the time, and here's why it's important as a historian to go to multiple archives and compare the sources. From contemporary Turkish newspapers in 1928, famously, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk switched the language from that Arabic script that you saw earlier to the Latin script that Turkey uses to this day. So, reading contemporary Turkish newspapers from the late 20s and early 30s, um, one local newspaper is a little kinder to the Jews, and one is a little nastier. And then that one that was a little nastier, there are all sorts of claims. Jews dominate the economy. Jews, or sometimes they're subtle. Sometimes they'll say those people who dominate the economy and who are bloodsuckers and leeches on the peasants and the villagers. Something needs to be done about this. There's a lot of resentment because certain people hoped that when the Christians, who really were the bourgeoisie, when the Greek and Armenian Christians left, some hoped that a Muslim Turkish bourgeoisie would take its place. In fact, many local Jews filled some of the roles left by departing Christians. For example, here are Jewish cheesemakers in Edirne. They're making a white cheese that is sort of famous throughout Turkey for this day and associated with this region. So I came across some I think it's fair to call them anti-Semitic articles in this local newspaper describing how wealthy and um, you know dominating the Jews are or certain Jews are. I went to the JDC archives and I read some reports of JDC folks from the US and Western Europe who had visited the region, and in their reports, they say these Jews are poor. Conditions are disgusting. We need to raise money for the Jews of Edirne. So when you put those two things side by side, you get a different picture. So, in fact, these were not rich Jews. We're seeing obviously a lot of stereotypes in the local Turkish press, but in a war-torn region that is underdeveloped by, even the standards of Istanbul or Ankara, even Jewish cheesemakers, grocers, haberdashers, could appear to be um, privileged and dominating the economy, to use the phrase of this Turkish newspaper. Nevertheless, it is a period of relative peace until 1934. So this period of relative peace would not last. In the summer of 1934, after an official from the Turkish government toured the region and met privately with local leaders, including some of the men who really want to create a Muslim bourgeoisie, the Jews of Eastern Thrace were attacked by their neighbors in a week of violence that spurred a Jewish exodus from the borderland, but not the country, interestingly. Very few Edirne Jews flee to Greece and Bulgaria. It's almost all to Istanbul for the time being. As I argue near the end of the book, the violence was caused by a perfect storm of factors, including local dynamics, international anxieties about borderland minorities, and a long Ottoman tradition of population management in the Balkans. The so-called Thrace events, to use the euphemism, remain the only case of mob violence against Jews in the history of the Turkish Republic, the only case of mob violence specifically targeting Jews. It is no coincidence that they occurred in a geopolitically sensitive border zone, a process that had started around 1912 was completed in 1934. The borderland was now untenable for all large groups of minorities. Today, no Jews live in Edirne. But in conclusion, I want to frame this not in the context of a deep culture of anti-Semitism, but rather in the context of the borderland. Those are the factors that I think we need to consider first and foremost when we understand why the Jews of Edirne and only Edirne were sort of evicted from their homes in the modern Turkish Republic. So that's the end of the formal presentation. I'm going to stop share now.
Thank you. This has been a fascinating lecture, and we'll now open the floor to questions. Just remember that your microphones are muted, and send us the questions via the Q&A function. And I would like to ask you a question first, is how did you get to this topic?
So great question. How did I get to the topic? It started with the Thrace events, the Trakya Olayları, when I was a grad student at Stanford. I'm curious, anomalies always interest me. And this is an anomaly in Turkish Jewish history. It's the only case, again, of mob violence specifically targeting Jews. So, what's going on there, right? And I did some research on the events of 1934, these pogroms in 1934. And as is often the case, I realized we have to go deeper. We have to go deeper. We can't just look at 1934 or even the 5 or 10 years before. There's a deeper story here, and it has a lot to do with Edirne's position in the borderland, or the way Edirne became a borderland relatively quickly. I then learned about La Voz de la Verdad, this Ladino newspaper in Edirne, which I immediately recognized as a very rich source. And then from there, one thing led to another, and I got deeper and deeper into that story and sort of worked backwards from the events of 1934, from these pogroms. And there's, Isabel, I see questions and sometimes, I see it for a second and then it moves down to the bottom. But there was a good question. I didn't read it closely, but someone said something, again, I'm out of the corner of my eye, something, you don't address blood libels. And I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to read your whole question. But the blood libel question is good, and I do address it in the book. I just didn't have time to include it in the talk. So the only blood libel that I came across in Edirne, the period that I study, late 19th, early 20th century, happens, guess when? During the Greek occupation. And the blood libel is largely a Christian phenomenon, and it's during the 2 years of Greek rule when we do see a blood libel. And so this nicely encapsulates the pros and cons, the two-sided nature of Greek rule. So on the one hand, Christian rule brings this sort of somewhat unknown thing, blood libel. But a Jew in parliament in Athens brings a new type of recourse, an official representative in the parliament of the country. And Edirne's representative in parliament is able to kickstart a process where the Greeks sort of send an investigator and a police chief is arrested and disciplined, and the government sends out circulars saying the blood libel is nonsense, and the sort of the unrest is sort of quelled. So the blood libel is a good question, and there's some, what this question might also allude to is there are some stories that resemble the blood libel that sort of circulate even among Muslim Turks in the region, but there's no eruption of violence and unrest against Jews as part of like a blood libel episode during the late Ottoman or Turkish period. It happens during the Greek period. No coincidence.
Hold on. There's another question that has to do with your research. How many languages are you proficient that helped you in your research?
That's a very good and fair question. So let me say what I don't know. I don't know Bulgarian and I don't know Greek. And I was able to get at some of those sources in translation. Sometimes, and so what I do know, I can read Ladino. I read contemporary articles in Hebrew, not so much rabbinic Hebrew from the time period I study. I read Turkish, both Ottoman and modern, um, French, and there's a lot of French documents from the teachers in the Alliance Israélite Universelle. But it's worth, French, again, French is not necessarily a foreign language at the time. It's a language that many of the communal elite speak and write in. Through the Ottoman archives, sometimes conveniently for me, the Turkish or Ottoman authorities, especially later in the Turkish Republican period, translate documents from the Bulgarian press or Bulgarian government or Greek press or Greek government. So I was able to get at some Bulgarian and Greek sources through Turkish government translations, and in some cases, with a little help from my friends.
Okay. I think one person is asking if you could repeat again why the Jews of Edirne were evicted and
Mm.
what they encounter when they fled to Istanbul.
Right. Great. Great. So the Jews of Edirne faced these pogroms in 1934, and about one-fourth of the population immediately flees. The remainder will slowly, trickle out over the next couple decades. It's not an all-out expulsion. Why? So I say there's a combination of forces. I'm glad you asked this question, so I didn't want to get into the weeds during the talk. It's a perfect storm of a few things. There's economic resentment. And furthermore, many of the local government leaders are also business leaders. And so really the many of the most powerful men in the province in the 1920s and early 30s um, were the ones crying for this Muslim bourgeoisie that was supposed to replace the Christian bourgeoisie. And we can there's a lot of actually economic data through these annual yearbooks, almanacs, where we can get a sense from people's names of like how many Jews, Muslims, and Christians worked in different occupations. And we see that indeed, uh, Christian names will largely disappear, and Jewish names will start to kind of fill up the ranks of some of those occupations. And I think so. Some of these leaders, some of these Muslim Turkish leaders, were frustrated that instead of a Muslim bourgeoisie, the Christian bourgeoisie was replaced by something of a Jewish bourgeoisie. But again, as the data and the reports from the JDC archives tell us, that's exaggerated. You have to take that with a grain of salt. Another factor, um, we have to look on the international level. To make a long story short, Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey, and even Romania are all engaged in this complicated process of, with varying degrees of persecution, trying to sort of nudge out or encourage minorities to leave the borderlands and go to their country. And I put that in quotes because, again, for centuries, um, there was no notion that someone's religion or language dictated where they were supposed to live. But that is the new rule in the early 20th century. And we see Bulgarians being forced or nudged out of Greece with different levels of coercion. We see Greek Orthodox Christians being expelled from Bulgaria. There's something going on between Bulgaria and Romania in the borderlands there. We see Turkish-speaking Muslims sort of being encouraged to leave Bulgaria and go to Turkey. And this creates a general sense among, in Athens, in Sofia, in Ankara, that you can't have minorities in the borderland. And in fact, I found a Greek newspaper from Alexandroupoli, Greece, just across the border from Edirne in Greece, that a friend helped me translate. And like a day or two after these Thrace events, these anti-Jewish attacks, which last for several days in Turkish Thrace, this Greek newspaper has the headline, "Let's imitate our neighbors." Look, Turkey's got it right. They know that you can't have minorities in the borderland. Why do we let Jews stay in our borderland? And there is no imitation at the time. There's no anti-Jewish pogrom in Greece at the time, but there's this growing notion, I think, among governments and certain elements of society that you can't have ethno-religious minorities in the borderland. Um, I'll leave it at that for the factors. There's a little more to it that I discuss in chapter 5, but I'll finish this thought by saying um, it's not an immediate sort of expulsion or eviction. Probably Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the leaders of Turkey, didn't want an actual violent expulsion. It seems that they were trying to pass laws and policies that would move Jews away from the border in a more gradual, orderly way. But probably this inspector who went around to every town in the region a few days before violence erupted was whispering into people's ears, like, hey, you have a green light to attack the Jews and loot their stores. This inspector went a little rogue, most historians think, and encouraged violence. So, as other historians have stated, the end goal, which was the eventual movement of Jews out of Edirne to Istanbul, fit the goals of Ataturk, even though he probably did not order violence.
You mentioned the Greek parliament. What extent this? Oh, I think I've jumped on my screen. Sorry. You mentioned the Greek parliament. To what extent these three states, I suppose, Greece, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, offer voting rights to citizens, including Jews? Was there mass electoral politics starting when?
Great question. So 1908 is the key year in the Ottoman Empire. The Young Turk Revolution brings back Parliament and the Ottoman Constitution, which had existed for a moment in 1877, 1876, 1877. And there are elections. They work off of an electoral system. It's a little bit complicated, but this is, to be clear, this is a constitutional monarchy. People are voting for parliament members. The Sultan is still the Sultan. That's a dynasty. People are voting for parliament members. People actually vote for electors, and then there's an electoral college that votes for the parliament members. An interesting bit about that in La Voz de la Verdad, which is probably written, almost every article is presumably written by Joseph Bar Ishaq. And he would often say, so here's the funny thing about Edirne. So Istanbul and the province, they get a Jewish parliamentarian. Izmir, Smyrna, and that region gets a Jewish deputy in parliament. Baghdad gets a Jewish deputy in parliament. Edirne does not. The Jewish population is just a little small for that. They don't quite have enough weight and influence to get a Jewish member of parliament. Now, the editor of La Voz de la Verdad assails the Jewish members of parliament for saying, whenever Joseph Bar Ishaq feels like there's what he calls antisemitismo in Edirne, that the Jews are being mistreated by the authorities, he assails our Jewish members of parliament for not speaking out and representing the Jews of Edirne. Now, others might counter, well, that's not the way a parliamentary system works. It's based on territory, right? Like members of parliament represent their regions, not a religious group. You know, your Edirne members of parliament should represent you. And so there's a little bit of, you can see Jews working out what exactly this means, right? Does a Jewish member of parliament from Istanbul speak out when the Jews of Edirne are wronged by the local authorities? Question mark. And that's a big debate. I mean, the editor of La Voz de la Verdad says yes, yes. I don't care if they don't represent our region. They're Jewish. They should speak out when Jews are wronged.
We have one question that is quite long, but I think it's, so I will read it and I'm happy to repeat if needed. Thank you for your presentation. Question. First, you argued that the Jews of Edirne in the early 20th century primarily perceived themselves as both Jewish and Ottoman. Is it possible that some also consider themselves European alongside Ottoman? Archival evidence shows that some Jewish families, particularly those of Italian or French origin, were under the protection of European diplomatic representation. In fact, I think Spanish as well. Do you interpret this diplomatic protection as reflecting a sense of European self-identification or primarily as a strategic legal choice? Second, what do we know about relations between Jews and Levantines and more broadly non-Muslim Jewish communities in Edirne? Have you encountered sources that shed light on this interaction? I think the second question may be a bit big, but yeah, if you could answer those questions.
Thank you so much for that question. Indeed, the sort of protege status or outright citizen status, French, Austrian, etc., is a big factor in many Ottoman Jewish communities, especially the port cities of Salonika and Istanbul and Izmir. It's less of a factor in Edirne. Edirne is an inland city. It's a major economic entrepot, but it's not a port city. There are relatively few Jews of foreign nationality in Edirne. Most Edirne Jews are Ottoman citizens. Some, I'm not going to say none. Of course, there are some people who had some sort of foreign status, either citizenship or this protege status. But it's not so common. It's not a driving force in the community the way it is elsewhere. Nevertheless, the question of European identity still pops up because of the Alliance schools and teaching students French and much of the communal elite coming to speak French. And we do see debates in La Voz de la Verdad about, what's the right level of Frenchness. There's certainly many benefits that come with the Alliance education, but let's not. But the newspaper also makes fun of people who ape French ways. That's their word, not mine. So first of all, so that's just my two-part answer. Interestingly, the foreign nationality question is phenomenon is less prevalent in Edirne. Nevertheless, we do see debates about, just how French should we be. It does. Final note on that question though. The foreign nationality thing, I don't see it in any of the sources. Really, I bump into very few Jews who are foreign nationals, or at least mentioned as such, until when the Ottoman-Italian War breaks out in 1912, has to do with Libya. Then something a little dicey happens, and the Ottoman Turkish press kind of starts like questioning the loyalties of Italian citizens in Edirne. And then La Voz de la Verdad kind of responds, and then I learn, okay, there are a handful of Jews in Edirne who have Italian citizenship. A handful. And La Voz de la Verdad kind of answers this, says like, we detect a whiff of anti-Semitism in the Turkish newspaper, kind of accusing the Italians of disloyalty, and there's a bit of a back and forth on that one. So that revealed to me that there were a few Italian citizens. What was their identity? I don't know. I didn't find sources sort of by them and about their worldview. So they're there, but relatively small in number compared to what we see in Salonika, Izmir, Istanbul.
Um, and I think we just have time for about 3 questions. So I think we received 2 questions at least about World War II and what happened to the Jews of Edirne during World War II.
So this is addressed in the epilogue of my book called Bordering the Holocaust. During World War II, um, the Nazis will occupy the northeastern strip of Greece. Bulgaria occupies most of northeastern Greece, but and again, I think this reflects the sensitivity of border regions. The Germans themselves take the strip that borders Turkey. Turkey is neutral in World War II, and no one on either side invades Turkey. The Germans occupy northeastern Greece, and in Didi the entire Jewish population, more or less, is sent to Auschwitz. I participated in a sort of both commemoration and academic conference in Didi a few years ago that was all about this topic. Meanwhile, just across the river, I mean, in some cases, literally a stone's throw, the Jews of Edirne are not victims of the Holocaust. They are victims of a very nasty Turkish policy called the wealth tax, Varlıkvergisi, in 1942, I think, sort of under the pretext of like wartime shortages. The Turkish government announces that these massive, massive taxes are going to be levied on Jews, Armenians, and Greeks. It's a thinly veiled project of wealth transfer. Again, back to this idea of creating a Muslim bourgeoisie. And Jews throughout Turkey are subject to these absurd taxes. People who couldn't pay were sent like to work gangs, and elderly people who sometimes perished. So this is a horrible policy that the Turkish government implements to this day. I know of some Turkish Jews, like people my age, who will say that their grandparents won't vote for the CHP, the party that is Ataturk's, the secular founding party of Turkey, that is now the opposition. Some elderly Jews in Turkey to this day remember the Varlık Vergisi and won't vote for the CHP, the CHP. However, Jews are not subject to the Holocaust. What does happen, and this is kind of the story that I close with, is a harrowing story about Jews from Bulgaria who are marched across the border and sort of dumped to Turkey. In Bulgaria allies with Nazi Germany. It sort of occurs to the Bulgarian government that the presence of Jews is a potential embarrassment in this alliance, and they start with, as we know, Jewish citizens of Bulgaria will ultimately be saved, but non-citizens, Jews who are not Bulgarian citizens, are expelled, and those who are from Turkey, the sources are kind of vague about this, or from Edirne. It's not clear exactly when they migrated, are marched across the border and like dumped back in Edirne. And now the local Edirne Jewish community has to figure out what to do with these people. And they have barely enough resources to like feed themselves. Times are tough. And they're trying frantically to provide shelter, food, clothing to these Jews from Bulgaria. It's wintertime. The Turks send them back to Bulgaria. The Bulgarians send them back to Turkey. It's like this game of human ping pong where they're being sent back and forth across the border. Ultimately, the Turkish authorities relent and they let these Jews stay in Edirne. But it's a troubling tale of the logic of the border really creating a nightmare for these Bulgarian Jews of Edirne origins. However, ultimately, they are spared and allowed to stay in Turkey.
Are there any Jewish structures remaining in Edirne today?
The synagogue was renovated. You can visit it to this day. I think one or two, like bar mitzvahs and weddings, have been held in the synagogue where, like, Jews in Istanbul who hail from Edirne returned for some ceremonies. But for the most part, it's a museum, which you can see. Other Jewish structures, the Alliance School is now like a Turkish public school. Um, You can see there are a couple homes in the Jewish quarter where you can still see the Star of David, etched into the molding. But by and large, it's just this recently renovated synagogue.
Great. And my very last questions, where can we find Edirne Jewish families living today? Are they still in
Right.
Istanbul, Israel,
Yeah.
US, France? Where are
Yes.
they?
Yeah, that's a good closing question. So as I said, in the short run, um, most went to Istanbul, and I didn't answer the previous question. How are they received? I mean, they were absorbed by the local Istanbul Jewish community. They did not face any special persecution by anyone in Istanbul. The Edirne Jews were famous for their choirs. There's a maftirim choir and style of music that flourished in Edirne through much of Ottoman history, and the Maftarim Choir now does its performances at a synagogue in Istanbul, and so the Istanbul Jews are very delighted to have them. So to this day, there are Edirne Jews in Istanbul. Many moved to Israel after 1948. I have spoken to some in the United States, in the Seattle region has Jews from Tech. So again, I see Tekirdağ out of the corner of my eye. I'm sorry, I can't read all the comments carefully, but Tekirdağ, which was on that map, Kirklareli, some of the smaller towns or mid-sized cities from that region. Many Jews have settled in Seattle. So a number of places: Istanbul, Tel Aviv, Seattle, New York.
Great. Thank you. We share with you the questions that we didn't get a chance to ask. I also want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you would like to purchase the book, there's a link for that in the chat as well. Today's webinar was recorded and will be available on JDC Archives website in about 2 weeks. And you can also find recordings of many of our past public programs there. Our next webinar will take place on March 2nd. Fred Lazin will give a lecture on Jewish migration from China to Israel from 1945 to 1951. And this is the first program in a new JDC Archives webinar series across oceans, across cultures, Jewish refugees in East Asia, and the role of the JDC. If you'd like to stay informed about upcoming events, we invite you to sign up for our e-newsletter. You'll find a link in the chat, and we look forward to seeing and welcoming you back for future programs. Thank you all.